Hello, and welcome to a special bonus episode of Vinyl Friday, in which I just answer your Beatles questions. You've submitted some fantastic questions to me. I've selected 10 of those questions to answer today. I've put aside about another 10 more to answer in long. So if you've submitted a question and I'm not answering it today, never fear. There is every possibility that at some point in the future, I'm going to do a whole long form video answering your question. Well, let's get to today's questions, yeah? Okay. Question 1 is, what is my favourite era for Beatles fashion? My answer to that would be late 1966, because they're starting to branch away from their sort of suit format and develop their own individual styles, which are quite interesting and colourful, literally and figuratively. But by late 1967, I feel like that style had become outlandish. They were almost like caricatures of what a hip person in 1967 looked like. So it's sort of late Revolver, Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields, that era, I think, just works perfectly. In particular, George's Glasses collection. Question 2, are there any outtakes I prefer over the originals? Yes. There are, as a matter of fact. The first I would say is One After 909, because I really love that early rock and roll sound, particularly what Paul is doing with the bass on that track. When they re-record it for the Get Back sessions, the bass is more of like a boom, 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 boom. I can't remember the exact bass line for the anthology version, but it's something more like... It's that, like, early rock and roll. Just suits the song really well, I think. The Let It Be version feels kind of lackluster and tired. No Reply is a favorite of mine. In my family, whenever we sing that song, we just finish every line with your face. I saw you be through your face. Kansas City, Hey, 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 Hey. I think the anthology version has so much more heart than the Beatles for Sale version. Across the Universe, the Anthology 2 version, I like this song best when it is stripped back, where it is just John and a guitar, and I think it works beautifully with what's probably a tabla behind it. It's calm, it's serene. And I think that's what the song needs to be, as opposed to syrupy and saccharine, which is what Phil Spector turned it into. Old Brown Shoe. I think it sounds better without the drums. I don't know what it is, but I've never loved the drums on that track, the sort of I just don't think it works as well as the anthology version. Baby, I'm in love with you. And then, of course, there are all of the White Album versions. And that takes... God, we're only up to question 3. That takes me to question 3. What are my feelings about the Esher demos? Editor Nancy here. For those unfamiliar with the Esher demos, essentially what happened is the Beatles returned from Rishikesh and they all got together at George Harrison's house for one day to regroup and have a listen to all the songs that they had written while they were away. Quoting from Rolling Stone, by nightfall, 27 acoustic demos had been committed to tape, forming the bones of what would forever be known as the White Album. It was an unprecedented endeavor for the band. Never before had they run through a complete body of work in advance, recording what was effectively an unplugged version for their next LP. This might be a bit of a Beatles hot take, but I actually prefer the Esher demos in a lot of cases to the released White Album versions. Don't bite my head off. The reason for this is that they were actually the first versions of the White Album songs that I heard. I was gifted Anthology 3, and then about 6 months later, I was gifted the White Album when I was around 14 years old. And so I fell in love with the songs in their raw acoustic forms. They just sounded too polished to me on the White Album version. And that's not to say that I don't love the White Album. I do, very much. But I have a real soft spot for the Esher demos. And I really love the idea of the Beatles just coming back from India and doing an entirely acoustic album. I think the romantic in me also feels like that was the last time that the Beatles all got together and made music together and it wasn't acrimonious. That's not to say that they didn't have good times as musicians, as bandmates going forward, as we can see in the Get Back documentary series. There were plenty of lovely moments there, but even then it feels like John's only halfway checked in, George has a foot out the door. With the Esher demos, I got the impression that they were all sort of sitting around jamming and having a good time. And I feel like maybe you can hear that coming through in the recordings. So yeah, I think I've answered the question. I love the Esher demos. I think they're fantastic. Question 4, what do I think of A Hard Day's Night? The film, not the album. I think that A Hard Day's Night is spectacular. I think it is an absolute work of art. I love it. I always have. The camera loves them. The scripting is great. And even if the performances are, in some cases, a little bit wooden, Paul, the chemistry between 4 best friends really comes across on screen. There's a reason that it's in the 1001 movies you must watch before you die. 5, what would have happened if the Beatles were women? In short, we wouldn't know. I don't think that we'd have ever heard them. At around the time that the Beatles were coming out, there was an all-girl band called the Liverbirds. Their songwriting is nowhere near as strong as Lennon, McCartney, and later Harrison. But if you read any of the press around them, everything is centered around the fact that they are women playing instruments. There is nothing to do with their music. All of the journalists were simply obsessed with the idea of women being in a band. For all we know, there has been a band with songwriters as equally talented as Lennon and McCartney, but we just never found out about them because no one would take them seriously. I always think of Joni Mitchell as an example, and I know this is a question about the Beatles, but I think that Joni Mitchell was a literal genius. She was an exceptionally good lyricist. She wrote harmonically complex and interesting music, and she could sing, which is like the trifecta. Who has that? She blew her peers out of the water, and I feel like only recently is she getting her due and her recognition as the brilliant musician that she was. Because again, so much of the press that she got to do when she was releasing albums in the 60s and 70s centered around the fact that she was a woman. Whereas when men are interviewed, far more often they are asked about their music, their musical choices, their skill as songwriters. So if Joni wasn't universally recognized as a genius until recently, I really don't think that, you know, in 1962, anyone would be taking a band of 4 women writing exceptionally good songs seriously. Question 6, what is my favorite Ringo moment in the Beatles catalogue? I think this one's fairly easy. It's his performance on With a Little Help from My Friends. With a little help from my friends. I feel like it is quintessentially Ringo. The song was clearly meant for him. He is the perfect singer for it. Not least because his career was made on the backs of his extremely talented friends. Don't get me wrong, that is not to say that Ringo was under-talented by comparison against the others. It's just that I don't know that anyone would know of him if it weren't for his extremely talented bandmates. Or perhaps just the combination of the 4 of them together. So he got by literally with a little help from his friends. And the fact that it's a call and response between him and his other bandmates, it's just heartwarming. It feels like he is being supported by his beloved friends. There's a real love for his bandmates, I think, that comes across in the performance. Question 7, what is my favorite individual Beatles lyric? Again, there's almost no competition. It is limitless, undying love, which shines around me like a million suns and calls me on and on across the universe. Beautiful, beautiful line. I'd like to put it on a t-shirt, but it's a bit long. I've been trying to work out what that design would look like for years. Question 8, would the Beatles have been as good as they were without the help of George Martin? No. Maybe that's controversial again, maybe that's a Beatles hot take, but George Martin contributed so much to that band, and while he does get credit for it, I don't think he gets enough credit, even to this day. And the best example I can think of that is that when I first heard She's Leaving Home, there was something about it that just didn't sit right with me. It didn't feel as good as the other tracks. The song was fine, but it just sounded a little bit wrong. When I found out that George Martin hadn't been the person to score it and to write the arrangement for it, it all sort of clicked into place and made sense. Because for me, it doesn't work with Paul's song. It sounds separate to it, as opposed to supportive of it, I guess. Obviously, George Martin had a great ear for music and was able to write some beautiful pieces, but I think he also really fundamentally understood what the Beatles were doing in their music and was able to complement it accordingly. And you know, like I would argue is partly responsible for the Beatles really elevating their game in the mid-60s. He was the one who really pushed Paul McCartney to have a string quartet on Yesterday.
Oh, yesterday came suddenly.
Which of course established a precedent for every other song that they had strings on, including Eleanor Rigby, Strawberry Fields Forever.
I think I know, yes, but it's all wrong.
Even A Day in the Life. Would the Beatles have chosen to go in that direction had they not been primed by George Martin and his classical experience? I don't know, but probably not. That's my thought. Number 9. Number 9. Number 9. Number 9. Why are their melodies so iconic? I mean, that's the million-dollar question. If we knew the answer to that, we would all be doing that. I think that's part of the joy of loving the Beatles. It's the mystery. How are they this good? You listen to the individual songs and yeah, they're good songs. But why do they transcend everybody else's songs? And I suppose I'm kind of trying to answer that with all these album miniseries, track-by-track miniseries that I'm doing. That we must be going on like 4 or 5 hours of me just talking about Beatles songs. I still don't think that I've managed to answer that question. I'll keep working on it. Question 10. Could we have had the Beatles without the Rutles?
The Rutles enjoyed the pleasant effects of tea, and it influenced enormously their greatest work, Sergeant Rutter.
Clearly the answer is absolutely not. Without the Rutles, there would have been no Beatles. In fact, the argument can be made that the Beatles just straight ripped off the Rutles. You know? Maybe it's an unpopular opinion, but sometimes I listen to the Rutles and I think, man, the Beatles really plagiarized this. That's it for me. If you enjoyed this video or you would like to support any of the weird things I do, I will leave a link in the description to my Buy Me a Coffee page, where you are most welcome to make a donation, but no pressure, friends. Thank you to everybody who has made a donation or signed up as a member. I really appreciate you. If you're curious about what any of my original music sounds like, again, I'll leave a link in the description to some of that. If you want to hear more of me talking about the Beatles, this is a link to the track-by-track Revolver mini-series that I've been working on recently. But yeah, thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you here next week. Have a great weekend!